They say a person can't be in two places at once. But 10 minutes after I watched my mother board a flight to Paris, my banker called to tell me she was standing right in front of him, draining my entire inheritance. Welcome back to the channel. Prepare yourself for a shocking tale from the Pacific Northwest today. My name is Kennedy. I am a 32-year-old risk assessment specialist residing in Seattle. Typically, I screen calls from numbers I don't know, but a strange pit in my stomach compelled me to pick up this specific line. The man speaking was Mr. Henderson, a senior executive at the bank my family has used for decades. His voice carried a tremor of anxiety as he broke the news that felt like a sledgehammer hitting my ribs. He informed me that my mother was currently at the main downtown branch, standing alongside my older sister, Bernadette, and they were urgently demanding the liquidation of our entire family trust fund. I froze, my thoughts turning to static because not even 60 minutes ago, I had personally dropped my mother off at the terminal for an international departure. That is simply not possible. I insisted, willing my voice to remain steady. My mother is currently flying to Paris. I watched her walk in. A heavy pause hung in the air, filled with professional worry, before Mr. Henderson lowered his volume and stated that the woman currently facing him looked identical to my mother and held every single legal ID card with her name on it. He begged me to come to the branch immediately, clarifying that the circumstances were escalating quickly, and he required me to verify these identities before any funds were released. I squeezed the phone until my knuckles ached, my pulse racing, as a horrific realization dawned on me. Someone was systematically dismantling my existence while I was completely oblivious. Before we unravel this disturbing mystery further, I have a quick request. Please subscribe and hit the like button to support raw stories like this one. Also, drop a comment mentioning which city you're viewing from before we proceed. Just 2 hours prior, I stood at the international departures drop-off of Seattle-Tacoma Airport, watching my mother head toward the TSA's checkpoint with a look of serene anticipation. I recalled how Mom clutched her passport tightly, as if it were a golden ticket to a fresh start, and I even felt tears welling up when she turned to wave goodbye one final time before vanishing into the swarm of passengers. My older sibling, Bernadette, had insisted on driving us there, acting surprisingly helpful by managing the heavy suitcases and obsessively refreshing the flight tracker on her smartphone. In hindsight, the way Bernadette kept checking her wristwatch and steering Mom toward the checkpoint felt less like familial affection and more like a frantic bid to remove her from my presence as fast as possible. Mom had appeared oddly detached during our last meal together, offering brief, scripted responses about her French itinerary and avoiding any sustained eye contact that might expose the burden she was hiding. I was seated in my tranquil living room, attempting to concentrate on unfinished spreadsheets, when the call from Mr. Henderson obliterated the morning's peace. I gazed at the plaster wall in absolute shock because the physical laws of my reality had just been inverted by a single statement from a banker. My brain failed to process the mental picture of Mom boarding an Air France jet against the impossible update of her waiting at a teller window downtown at this exact second. It was logistically unfeasible for a human to be cruising over the Atlantic and sitting in a Seattle lobby simultaneously. However, the seriousness in the executive's tone implied he was not an error. I found myself clutching the side of my oak desk until my fingers went numb, hunting for a loophole in the schedule that could clarify how this complex fraud was conducted right under my nose. Whenever I attempted to persuade myself that this was just a massive administrative error, the memory of Bernadette's arrogant smirk at the terminal returned to torment me. I understood with a nauseating lurch that Mom never actually scanned her ticket while I was watching because Bernadette had demanded to walk her to the very limit of the security queue where I was prohibited from entering. They must have waited for my vehicle to leave the airport garage before casually strolling back out of the terminal and driving directly to the city core to enact their actual agenda. The image of them riding in a cab, chuckling about how effortlessly they had played me, made my blood sizzle with a rage I had never felt before. Bernadette was the one always drowning in significant credit card balances and failed entrepreneurial schemes. Despite this, Mom continued to rescue her regardless of the financial pressure it put on the rest of us. I remembered the countless times our late father had cautioned us that the trust was designed as a safety net for all, not a personal slush fund for my sister's chaotic habits. The epiphany that Mom was now a willing participant in a plot to empty that account behind my back felt like a knife twist far sharper than any monetary theft could be. Betrayal never comes from your enemies. It always comes from the ones you hold closest. I snatched my keys and sprinted for the exit, knowing I had to get to the bank before the assets disappeared into the pockets of the two individuals I believed I could rely on. 30 minutes after that life-altering ring, I was parking in the congested lot of the downtown branch, my palms still vibrating against the leather wheel. I walked into the cavernous lobby and immediately felt the blast of air conditioning, though it did nothing to cool the inferno of fury and shock burning in my gut. To escape detection by those two recognizable silhouettes, I elected to hide behind one of the giant stone columns that bordered the VIP banking area. From this concealed angle, I had a clear view of the back of my mother's hairstyle and the rigid, predatory stance of Bernadette as she loomed over the wooden desk. It felt like a lucid nightmare to observe Mom sitting there in the exact clothes she wore to the airport, confirming that the Paris vacation was nothing more than a mathematical lie. Bernadette seemed to be in a state of extreme stress, her gaze shifting around the hall while she fiddled with the scarf at her throat. She was relentlessly shoving a pile of withdrawal forms toward Mom, her manicured nails clicking rhythmically against the varnish whenever the teller turned to consult his screen. The VIP section was usually a zone of hushed dignity, but the anxiety emanating from my sister's end of the desk was so dense that even nearby patrons appeared to be throwing suspicious looks their way. I observed Mom reach for the heavy pen offered by the staff, her motion looking lethargic and burdened, as if she were supporting the mass of the entire planet on her spine. As I shifted my footing to secure a superior angle, I could finally discern the muffled but unmistakable audio of their conversation floating through the silent air of the room. Bernadette leaned into Mom's personal space, her tone dipping to a cruel, regulated hiss that sent a glaciated shiver down my back. Just sign the documents fast, Mom, because I have already verified everything. And that little Kennedy brat is certainly not going to guess a thing until it is way too late, she pressed with a malicious grin forming on her mouth. My heart slammed against my chest cavity like a caged animal while I overheard the dismissive way my sibling spoke of me as a hurdle to be vaulted. Mom hesitated with the pen suspended just a fraction of an inch above the dotted line. Her fingers trembling so badly, the ink was in danger of staining the crisp sheet. I feel so terribly ashamed doing this behind her back, particularly since this is the final portion of the savings your dad left for both of you to split. Mom answered in a brittle mumble that lacked the authority she typically commanded. For a brief heartbeat, I prayed that the scraps of her morality would win out, and she would cast the pen aside in a moment of maternal protection. However, my optimism was immediately pulverized when Bernadette leaned in closer, her eyes tightening into frozen slits of absolute avarice. She is already wealthy enough, Mom, so she definitely does not require this specific sum to fix her life. Like I do, Bernadette argued with a cadence that was both controlling and devoid of empathy. She grabbed Mom's wrist to stabilize it, her hold resembling a shackle rather than a helping hand, forcing the pen toward the bottom of the page. Seeing my mother, gradually lower the tip to the document felt like witnessing someone autograph my execution order, effectively deleting 32 years of faith with a few swirls of ink. I stood rooted behind that stone pillar, my lungs feeling as if they were packed with concrete, while the truth of their treachery finally anchored in my spirit. The woman who had read me bedtime stories and the sister I had shared childhood, whispers with, were now plotting in public view to strip me of my rightful heritage. Bernadette started to collect the signed papers with a victorious gesture, her expression brightening with a hunter's joy that made me want to yell in pain. I understood then that my father's cautions regarding her nature had been completely precise. Yet I had been too dazzled by the idea of family to perceive the viper coiled next to me. The silent grandeur of the bank appeared to ridicule my inaction, but I knew I had to stay obscured for a few moments longer until I had accumulated every scrap of proof required to demolish their fabricated narrative. 15 minutes of focused surveillance ensued as I stayed tucked in the gloom of the column, my brain sprinting with the necessity to engage professional assistance before the scenario hit a point of no return. I dipped into my jacket and retrieved my smartphone with shaking hands, rapidly punching in the contact for my personal attorney, Connor, who managed my father's complicated estate and knew every detail of our legal background. When he answered, I kept my volume as muted as possible while describing the bizarre theater playing out 30 feet away at the service desk. Also fired off a desperate text to my closest friend, Skylar, a genius cybersecurity expert who had a talent for exposing digital trails that most individuals would never dream of checking. I needed them to serve as my vision and hearing in the corporate realm because I was currently immobilized by the emotional gravity of my own kin's double-crossing. Skylar replied almost instantly, requesting I forward the reservation code and flight details Mom had emailed me that morning as evidence of her journey. I observed from a distance as Bernadette continued to orbit Mom like a scavenger bird, totally ignorant that I was methodically taking apart their complex ruse from across the room. Minutes later, Skylar's ID lit up my display with a collection of images that validated my darkest theories regarding the fraudulent nature of this day. He found that the Air France pass to Paris had actually been submitted for a complete refund less than 10 minutes after I drove away from the airport drop-off Kennedy. I am telling you plainly that this ticket is nothing more than pricey garbage. Because they formally voided the booking before the aircraft even taxied, Skylar's voice buzzed in my earbud with absolute conviction. The verification that they had essentially utilized the airport as a set for a dramatic play caused a surge of sickness that was nearly impossible to swallow. It was evident that while I was driving home with a heavy spirit, they were likely giggling in a rideshare about how simply they had toyed with my feelings for their monetary benefit. While I was absorbing the digital proof from Skylar, Connor rang back with an even more alarming discovery concerning the forms being handled at the window. He had succeeded in flagging the activity with the bank's central operations and found that Bernadette had already filed a power of attorney instrument that morning. This particular paper bore what looked to be my notarized autograph, effectively giving Bernadette the power to act for me regarding the trust assets. I felt a frigid wind pierce my bones as I understood my own sister had committed a major crime by faking my signature just to override my permission. Greed is a hole that can never be filled. No matter how much family you throw into it, you must remain composed and keep your range for a few more minutes, Kennedy, because this is now a case of structured wire fraud and identity theft. Connor cautioned with a professional gravity that helped stabilize my racing mind. I chose to utilize my device to film a covert video of the exchange at the desk, recording the exact second Bernadette leaned in to direct Mom's trembling fingers across the sheet. The clip clearly displayed the forceful nature of Bernadette's actions and the distinct reluctance and Mom's body language as she was bullied into endorsing the illicit papers. This video file would be the final nail in the coffin for their plot, offering undeniable confirmation that Mom was not acting of her own volition, and that Bernadette was the chief architect of this criminal project. I saw the teller collect the signed folio and walk toward the rear office, presumably to secure final clearance from Mr. Henderson, who was awaiting my cue to step in. The quiet of the bank floor felt roaring as I waited for the snare to snap around the two women, who had spent their existences under the shield of the very fund they were now attempting to gut. I knew the next few minutes would alter the path of our lineage forever, but I was no longer invested in rescuing them from the fallout of their own decisions. My dad had dedicated his years to constructing a reputation of honor, and I was not going to let his memory be stained by the avarice of a sibling who never understood the worth of honest labor. 10 minutes later, I chose to probe the absolute boundaries of their fraud by phoning Bernadette directly to see how she would respond when confronted with an abrupt and unforeseen obstacle. Monitored her from my concealment as she dug into her luxury bag and retrieved her buzzing mobile, her face morphing instantly from predatory intensity to a guise of rehearsed naivety. She picked up with a bright, sing-song tone that made my skin prickle with pure disgust because I knew precisely what she was masking behind that sweet pitch. I could see her leaning comfortably against the counter, appearing like a woman without a single worry, while she readied a sequence of deliberate falsehoods for her sister. You should relax and nap, because Mom is likely dozing on the aircraft by now, so please do not disturb her at this time, Bernadette said without even a flutter of her eyelids, sweeping the room with a terrifying lack of guilt. She continued, describing how she had just finished tidying her apartment and was settling in for a calm afternoon of rest after the emotional farewell at the terminal. It was a frightening exhibition of sociopathic conduct, watching her lie so smoothly while standing inches from the very human she claimed was thousands of miles over the ocean. I stayed mute on the line for a few beats, allowing the mass of her treachery to land before I finally cut the connection without exposing my coordinates. Immediately after, I dialed Mom's contact and watched with a burdened heart as the piercing noise of her ringtone bounced through the hushed, high-ceilinged atrium. I witnessed Mom jolt in her chair as if electrocuted, her complexion turning a spectral shade of pale while she gazed at my caller ID glowing on her screen. She looked toward Bernadette with wide, terrified eyes, her hands quivering so intensely she nearly dropped the gadget onto the stone tiles. Instead of taking the call, Mom desperately mashed the reject key and stuffed the phone deep into her coat, her chest rising and falling with the effort of her mounting panic. I remained in the gloom, observing the silent trade of fearful whispers between them as they realized their meticulously built fortress of deception was beginning to fracture. She is ringing me, Bernadette, and if she discovers I never actually flew to Paris, then both of us will be totally destroyed, Mom hissed in, a frantic murmur that was clearly audible from my position. Her vocals were thick with a blend of fright and a delayed sense of shame that was far too little and way too late to make any genuine impact on me. Bernadette simply seized Mom's forearm with a painful squeeze, her features twisting into a mask of pure annoyance as she attempted to force her to re-engage with the paperwork. The humiliation and desperation pouring off my mother was agonizing to view, particularly as I realized she was more terrified of being apprehended than she was of actually harming me with her deeds. She was ensnared in a trap of her own making, caught between the unyielding hunger of her eldest child and the looming verdict of the daughter she had just stabbed in the back. Bernadette started to whisper even more forcefully into Mom's ear, likely feeding her more fabrications about how this was necessary and how they just needed to complete the transaction before I could interfere. It was a pathetic spectacle watching two adult women scramble like petty shoplifters in a venue that symbolized the very stability they were trying to dismantle for selfish profit. I felt a peculiar clarity wash over me watching them squirm, realizing the people I called family were nothing more than strangers wearing recognizable masks. The dramatic show they had staged at the airport was now being swapped for a chaotic, clumsy sprint to the finish line of their felony. I tightened my hold on my phone, knowing I had grabbed enough proof to guarantee their agenda would never see the light of day. The stage play you two have been performing is finally concluded, I whispered to myself with a frigid, steady resolve that shocked even me. The period for watching was finished, and the moment for a direct, catastrophic meeting had finally landed in the corridors of the bank, 30 minutes after collecting all the undeniable data needed to shatter their mirage. I walked out from behind the massive column and marched straight toward the VIP desk. The click of my boots against the polished ground seemed to reverberate with a heavy finality that made several clerks look up in alarm. Bernadette was midway through leaning toward the staff member when she sensed my approach and spun around, her face instantly draining of its arrogant assurance as it shifted from a flush to a ghostly chalky gray. Mom let out a sharp, strangling intake of pure horror as she fumbled with the gold pen, causing the entire heap of legal folders to slide off the ledge and sprawl across the floor in a chaos of disorganized treason. I stood there with arms folded, watching them scramble to recover some fragment of pride, while the mood in the chamber turned as biting as a winter frost dot. Do you view me as your offspring, or just some type of biological ATM to pay for her endless disasters? I asked Mom with a tone so glazed with ice, it seemed to freeze the oxygen between us. She looked up with tear-filled eyes, her bottom lip shaking as she struggled to locate the words to explain why she was currently assisting my sister in robbing our future. Bernadette finally located her voice and straightened her spine, her hands clenched into white-knuckled balls as she attempted to swap her obvious terror for a mask of unearned moral outrage. She started to claim that Mom had already confessed to the bias because she felt I was already secure enough to handle my existence without this legacy. I disregarded her frantic excuses and placed my phone on the surface, showcasing the crisp digital evidence that the Paris flight had been voided for a full rebate nearly an hour prior. I also revealed the legal warning from Connor concerning the falsified power of attorney, which caused the teller to immediately retract the documents from Bernadette's reach. Mom started to weep softly into her palms, whispering that she only wished to help Bernadette secure a new beginning since I had already attained so much victory in my profession. It was a weak justification that only served to spotlight the deep, decaying roots of the favoritism that had ruled our family mechanics for my entire adult life. You possess everything already, Kennedy. So why can you not just let me have this single opportunity to repair my errors? Bernadette shrieked at me, her voice fracturing with a blend of desperate avarice and a lifetime of stored jealousy. She stared at me with a loathing so raw and exposed that I realized she had never actually loved me. Viewing me only as a competitor for our mother's warped affection, the security officer moved a few paces, nearer as the decibel level of her rant began to pull the gaze of every single individual in the main hall. I looked her directly in the pupils without blinking, feeling a sensation of total clarity as I prepared to cut the last bonds that kept me tied to their poisonous loop. I do not surrender to burglars, even when they happen to be the very individuals who share my genetics, I answered with a chill that made Bernadette recoil as if I had slapped her. Mom attempted to reach for my fingers, her expression a landscape of crushing remorse, but I stepped back to evade her contact because her physical nearness felt like a slur against my character. Kennedy, please comprehend that your sister was going to forfeit everything she owned if we did not step in with this capital, Mom begged, with a frantic pitch that only cemented her role as a facilitator for Bernadette's dangerous lifestyle. I understood then that Mom was prepared to burn my trust and my father's name just to shield her preferred child from facing the organic results of her own awful choices. The hush that trailed her plea was dense with the mass of 32 years of silent hurt, and the final understanding that my family had been a fiction from the start shifted my focus away from their weeping faces and toward Mr. Henderson's glass door. Knowing the era of discussion was officially done and the era of legal repercussions was about to commence, only 10 minutes after the hideous reality was laid bare in the center of the lobby, Detective Miller arrived at the branch with a compact squad of investigators to lock down the area and confiscate all pertinent files. The arrival of police immediately shifted the vibe from a domestic quarrel to a serious criminal probe as they started to collect the fake papers and the taped proof I supplied. Bernadette realized her position was becoming critical, so she started to frantically reverse course by attempting to dump the entire load of blame onto our aging mother's back. It was a spineless and frantic maneuver to witness my sister asserting that Mom was the actual genius behind the plot. Just to dodge facing a likely prison term, I stood by quietly while I surrendered my phone to Detective Miller, giving him the crisp audio files and the digital trail Skylar had aggregated to demonstrate Bernadette was the one pulling the levers. Mom seemed to implode internally as she grasped that the daughter she had always shielded was now ready to trade her liberty without a single second of pause. She slumped against the wooden desk with her face in her grip, her frame trembling, with the power of a sorrow that was finally anchored in the truth of her own bad decisions. Bernadette continued to yell about how Mom had coerced her into the plan, creating a sad display that made even the veteran officers look at her with a sense of total repulsion. I watched Detective Miller examine the forged authorization form with a stern look before he turned his focus toward the woman who had generated so much ruin in our clan. Bernadette, you are formally being charged with financial fraud and the criminal forgery of a co-owner's autograph on these bank instruments, Detective Miller announced with a professional command that muted her frantic babble almost instantly. He advised her that the case against her was overwhelming and that her efforts to frame a fragile senior citizen would likely only worsen her standing during the pending trial. Mom started to wail with a heavy, fractured noise as she realized her blind loyalty to her golden child had finally resulted in the complete annihilation of her family's honor. What on earth have I done to my existence? And how could I have forfeited everything I treasured just for the sake of a single horrific fabrication? Mom sobbed aloud while grasping at the empty space, as if hunting for a solace that was no longer accessible to her. The shame in her tone was suffocating, but I stayed positioned several yards away because I could not find it in my soul to extend her any type of forgiveness for her treachery. I looked at the woman who had reared me and realized that her persistent bias had manufactured a beast in Bernadette that was now turning back to consume the very individual who had fed it. It is sadly far too late for you to lament your cruel and planned favoritism now that the fallout has finally landed at your entry, I told Mom with a steely resolve that shocked even the patrolman standing close. I clarified to her that my pardon was not something she could simply purchase with weeping after she had spent months plotting to delete my legitimate spot in my father's will. Bernadette was escorted toward the rear offices for deeper interrogation, her face contorted into a guise of pure hate as she fired one last poisonous stare in my direction. The banking floor began to revert to its standard hum of commerce, but I knew that for us, there was no returning to the way things were before the sunrise. I autographed the required witness forms with a stable hand, feeling an odd sense of release that the weight of guarding their secrets was finally off my back for good. 1 week after the last scraps of my previous life were taken apart in that frigid bank hall, The justice system in Washington started to dispense its unavoidable and severe ruling. Bernadette was formally indicted on numerous counts of grand larceny and identity fraud, eventually facing a federal detention sentence that would remove her from society for several years. Mom was left to reside in the resounding quiet of her massive vacant residence, while she wrestled with the crushing load of her own remorse and the forfeiture of both her girls in separate ways. The bias that had once been the bedrock of her bond with Bernadette had ultimately become the very tool of her social and emotional quarantine. I observed from afar as they were compelled to traverse the wreckage of their own construction, feeling a curious sense of disconnection that superseded the fiery rage I had held for so long. I utilized those subsequent days finishing the draining paperwork to vend the family estate and finalize the legal divorce of all my lingering assets from their reach. To guarantee a genuinely clean slate, I altered my main contact number and relocated to a contemporary loft on the opposite end of Seattle, where nobody knew my history or my heartbreak. The act of erasing old numbers and updating my emergency contact data felt like a mandatory ceremony of cleansing for my spirit. I realized my devotion had been wielded as a bludgeon against me for decades, and it was finally time to take back the honor my father had always desired for me. My fresh existence was constructed on a bedrock of extreme honesty with myself and a rejection to permit anyone to abuse my sense of duty ever again. The mental path toward recovery was not nearly as swift or as straight as the court processes had been during those intense weeks. There were many evenings when I awoke feeling the ghost ache of my mother's double cross. Yet each dawn I reminded myself that I had selected self-worth over a poisonous and unilateral truce. I started to go to frequent counseling sessions to deprogram the reflex of burning my own requirements, just to appease the unending appetites of people who did not truly cherish my existence. I discovered that my value was not linked to how much I could supply for others, but rather to how competently I could defend the borders of my own life. The tranquility I located in my new silent condo was far more precious than the messy validation I had spent 32 years attempting to win from individuals who were never going to grant it. Looking back at the woman who crouched behind that marble column, I barely identified the person who was once terrified of making a fuss or wounding her mother's delicate ego. I have evolved into a variant of myself that is much frostier toward lies, but significantly warmer toward my own internal expansion and long-term health. The stabbing at the bank was a crushing hit, but it was also the spark that permitted me to snap the chains of a lifetime of being an unseen background actor in someone else's play. I now move through the globe with a sense of silent power, knowing my father's name is secure and my destiny belongs solely to me. The most critical wisdom I have gained from this whole nightmare is that compassion must never be paired with ignorance, and blood is never a legitimate excuse to tolerate the infringement of your legal or human rights. You must grasp that those who genuinely adore you will never request you to delete your own persona or burn your future to hide their careless errors. Real honor means rising for the truth, even when it is awkward or when it compels you to step away from the individuals you once loved most in the universe. Thank you so much for remaining with me until the very conclusion of this agonizing path, for listening to the reality of my family's deceit. This ordeal has been a massive load to haul, but sharing it with all of you has given me a deep sense of finality and recovery. I would genuinely appreciate hearing your opinions on my choice to sever contact entirely. So please hit that like button and subscribe to Winds of Thought, and share your own viewpoints and stories in the comments below.